the Beneficent, the Merciful, may his peace and blessings be upon our Holy Prophet and his sinless progeny. Welcome to the conversation. Join myself, Daniel Pizer, and Sheikh Yahya Seymour as we discuss the challenges that are faced daily by converts to the religion of Islam and other issues concerning them. In the previous episode, we were discussing the topic of the somewhat split identity that the convert has, both as a new Muslim and sometimes even much later on after the conversion process. Some of this we talked about in terms of trying to reintegrate the self, or ways that we would find ourselves as converts encountering a lot of free time and what we do with that, as well as the change in identity that comes about in general, I guess you would say, from the process, and trying not to overdo it, or at least be aware of that. Even, I think, in your advice towards the or closing remarks in one episode, Sheikh, you said that one useful thing is that community leaders, at least those who are somewhat in tune with that, or aware of sort of the process that converts go through sometime, that they can notice if someone is sort of jumping in a little too quickly, or is out of their depth.
Sure.
So I guess one of the things we wanted to continue discussing about this issue was the concept of occupying those two different worlds and sort of fleshing that out a little more fully. So with that, I'll ask you for your thoughts on the subject.
Well, you know, I have largely personal thoughts on this, which are dependent and built upon my own previous experiences. If I'm to... I think in order to highlight the best way to go around this is a largely experimental discussion. It's very easy for us both with the ability of hindsight to be able to say, I should have done this, but had we done that, we also don't know how things would have played out. So let's highlight the factors which I believe cause massive issues here, just so the audience, and so potentially anyone who's thinking of converting, or any new converts who find themselves in this situation, would be able to appreciate what we're saying. You find yourself with the immediate dichotomy of an identity crisis, and this is largely natural, given that most people come to Islam through either a religious experience or what I would define as an existential crisis. Many of us, statistics show that at least most of us devote at least 5 minutes a day to thinking about the problem of death and what happens after death and what happens when we die. Many people come to Islam existentially after questioning these things and thinking about what is the purpose of life, is there an afterlife, so on and so forth. So when they come to Islam, now they have several other things to consider. Other religions, like, say for example, a confessional faith, Christianity, it's quite easy due to its lack of restrictions. Sure, it might restrict you in terms of the etiquettes of how you behave. It might restrict you in terms of the language you use. It would not really allow you to swear in a vile manner. Well,
theoretically speaking.
I mean, you have some Church of England ministers in UK who have been known to call their opponents by words that I would be, on Twitter this is, that I would be appalled for my own daughter to hear, but you know, that aside, so that's a particular liberal branch of the church. We find once we come to Islam now, there's several things we have to take into account. So for example, you might previously had a circle of friends. Now, I mentioned in the previous episode how my circle of friends were completely... It would have just been so incompatible for them to have to deal with the political correctness of having a practicing Muslim friend who would be hanging around with them all the time. Likewise, say for example you're a patriotic person. I believe that, you see, in US it's a lot more common to be patriotic without being known as a nationalist. In UK, on a broader level, the more patriotic you are, sometimes the more nationalist and racist you're perceived as being. In Scotland, it's just a part of your life. I mean, if you don't love Scotland, then it's quite politically correct in Scotland to. They don't care about political correctness. They'll just tell you to basically go back to wherever you came from. And so we've had it ingrained in us, I guess, the education system, which taught us to deal with our identity as a minority ethnic group with a minority culture within the land of UK who had colonized them, had instilled with us that particular identity. And so as a result, when I first converted, I've got identity issues myself, man. I'm half Filipino, half Scottish, so there's already that struggle. Yeah. So after converting, I'm thinking to myself, so who am I, what do I define myself by?
And as we said in the previous episode too, because of the age you converted at, you essentially could not have chosen a more tumultuous stage in terms of construction of self-identity.
I agree.
Around sort of the 15, 16, I mean, that's really very precisely...
I agree, which is why if the community, its treatment towards converts does not improve by the time I reach, say, for example, 40, I'll probably go and take a couple gap years from the community in order to avoid a midlife crisis and run back to some previous identity. And I'm joking on that note, but of course, what we're saying here is, at the age I chose to convert to Islam, it was a very young age, one which is crucial to the formation of identity. And it's less common for brothers to convert at that age, but with sisters I've heard of people converting at very similar ages.
It's hard for me to speculate now just because of how much outreach or dawah, whatever you want to say, is conducted online.
Sure.
Or how much people's encounters with Islam is online.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think probably both of us grew up in the generation where youth kind of, I'm not sure if the word mastered the internet is what I'm looking for, but it essentially like became a tool of young people as opposed to something that was maybe predominantly developed and used for national defense purposes or other things like this, and became widely popularized. And so you start encountering information this way in a way that maybe even one generation earlier you would have encountered that information in a library, not...
No, absolutely. And so information was at your fingertips. Now, of course, it's like a library, really. It can be good and bad. I mean, even in a library, you'd have to worry about the particular biases of an author that you might come across. But on the internet, the most radical of authors can have their work become mainstream and available to a mainstream. And we see that very much now that we live in a time of Islamophobia and a general hatred towards Islam on a general scale. Of course, this is largely hatred which should be ventilated at a particular reading of Islam. But you know, sadly, we Shias have not done much of an effort to convey that there is the Islam of Ali Muhammad and there is the Islam of the terrorists who killed Ali Muhammad.
Yeah, exactly.
And as a result, we were left in this mess.
So, in terms of sorting out identity, though, I guess the question is, how do we not give up so much? In a way, you know, it's hard for me, I guess, to see other new Muslims or converts struggling not just to give up negative things from their past, I don't know, whatever you want to say, habits or behaviors, whatever. That's one thing. But to see them struggling to actively give up positive aspects of their identity too is sometimes troubling, you know. And so I guess even in my own life, I still have to struggle, not as much in Iraq in the same way, but certainly in the U.S. Of achieving some kind of balance, some kind of sense of self that feels kind of hits the sweet spot, I guess.
No, absolutely. I think that you're right. And here, allow me to make somewhat of an emotional appeal to the audience and to our community at large, because I know that there is many like-minded people who, and again, I think when we speak about these issues now, we might even be speaking not necessarily only of converts, but also of younger people in our community who got interested in religion and feel this. Now, as someone who has to think as a father, I have to consider, of course, my daughters, in the sense that I and yourself, no matter what nonsense we encounter from the community, you and I have been able to mentally distinguish between Islam and Muslims, and Shiism and lovers of Ahlul Bayt.
I truly hope so.
Inshallah ta'ala. So, as a result, there's certain things which are part and parcel of the spirit of Islam, which were very attractive to me, and were things I would have even been involved with before I became Muslim. Things like concerns of social justice, concerns with activism, concerns with equality, with the betterment of society at large, regardless of their race, faith, or social backgrounds. And so, whilst I found that this was an integral part of Islam, and that was also one of the things that encouraged me, because as I said, I was involved in minor grassroots work in Scotland before I converted, I found that once I entered into Islam, there was less of a concern with it. And if there was a concern, it was a very generic concern. There might be a fundraiser with a charity called Islamic Relief, which again was all about going back to Muslim countries and not thinking about the poverty and deprived condition of the average Joe Bloggs human being in the Western societies that we live in. Now, it's all fair and well to care about the Muslims back home. After all, they are our brothers in faith. But at the same time, what kind of image are we giving to Islam where we come with this colonialist mindset, where we don't even care about the nation that we're living in temporarily, according to the mindset that says that we're just here for economic prospects, prosperity, and we go back to our original home countries.
Which in your case would be Scotland, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless my Filipino passport comes through at some point. Might want to take a gap here. Inshallah.
Some good top league opportunities.
Definitely. Back to my point. Sorry. So we were saying that once I entered into Islam, I found that the community would often ridicule social activism. And they might ridicule kind of these actions. I've even heard it said, I've heard derogatory remarks about, who wants to have to be serving homeless people, stuff like that, soup kitchens, all that stuff. Yeah, I've heard these nasty remarks before. And so, whilst I first converted, this was something I began to give up as a result of finding that Muslims weren't really interested in it. And that was completely wrong. With hindsight, I wish I had continued it and kept it up. But the point is here, I'm trying to make, that I feel to some degree when it came to the issue of social morality and dictates which are mandated by the etiquettes and activist spirits of Islam,
that you were doing better with that.
I was doing better prior to conversion than after conversion. And the point about my daughter here, or my daughters rather, is that to some degree, I do worry that they will see, for example, the values of liberal socialist Sweden, where they happen to be right now, and they might think to themselves, why is it that the godless liberal here cares more about humanity on the justice front than the community which is preaching from the pulpits every week that their imams have mandated, commanded, and instilled within the community a spirit of justice?
That one hits a nerve in general with me, just because I think for me, I converted for a lot of the same, I I guess, similar values that I saw in Islam. I think when I think back about it, I felt like by choosing this faith, by adopting Tashayu, that it was not so much actually that much of a radical change or reorientation of my life as much as it was sort of more fully realizing a lot of the values that I already had. On the other hand, I certainly had the same experience that you did in terms of, it's interesting because I don't think we've ever actually spoken about that part of it before, but in terms of after converting, seeing that people in the communities, although I think frequently Muslims with good intentions use a lot of the sort of charitable good works that are encouraged by a religion, use that encouragement as in a form of tabligh, essentially to say that, give the impression this is something we all do a lot of.
Yes.
And that'll appeal to one group of people to sort of bring them in. And I was part of that sort of niche market, maybe.
Sure.
You know, lo and behold, certainly you find tons of injunctions towards charity, and not just charity in like a Band-Aid kind of way, but also some sort of structural solutions for inequality, but that they are not really discussed very much or applied, or that the most they'll be discussed is in sort of like more deviant philosophical texts or political texts or whatever.
Sure.
I think for me, and we're going to have to go to break in a minute, but one of the things that maybe restrained me a little bit from continuing to do a lot of the social justice work that I had done before, that I'd really devoted a lot of my life to until that point, was feeling like I had to cement kind of an authentic Islamic identity.
Yes.
And so I needed to find sort of what the authentic Islamic political or social economic position was. You know, and the most that you get out of that, essentially, or that you're ever going to get recommended, are books like from Shahid Sadr or other people like this, which are fine.
Yes.
I'm not bringing this up to criticize them, but is something that was, I think, to a large extent written for like Iraqi and Middle Eastern national politics, and not something that speaks to issues of social and economic justice in the same way in the West, right? Either way, I guess what I felt like was that it was definitely a marginalized issue. Let's pick it up from there in a minute when we return, but I guess the last thing I was kind of thinking of there was that in general, this is still a massive deficiency in the Ummah in the West, and an area that they have not, we have not, I guess, managed to learn well from other faiths in terms of the impact that kind of practice can have. And sometimes actually, even when it's brought up from the angle of, well, we can get more people to convert, and not, well, this is the right thing to do.
No, absolutely,
you know?
absolutely. And
So
there's a degree of sickness in that. But as you said, after the break,
Yeah.
we'll come back to that issue.
Inshallah, you'll continue to join us. Our email information will be posted on the screen, and other contact. Thank you for joining us on The Conversation. We're going to go to a short break now. Welcome back to The Conversation. You're joining myself, Shaikh Daniel, and Shaikh Yahya as we discuss the issues related to convert identity and sometimes the identity crisis that can come with converting. Before we left off, we were discussing the issue of how communities approach, we could say, social justice or social and economic justice, this kind of thing. And what I had been saying to you was that, in a sense, I felt, I don't want to use the word conned, but I'm trying to think of a nicer, nicer one, by at least what I would hear and then what I would see in practice. I feel like something that if we
Bamboozled. Led astray.
we're gonna find some more Spike Lee words we can throw in here. But for real, I think it was that was kind of a hard moment for me, because coming from the family that I come from, there's always been a pretty big emphasis on doing work for social equality and justice. And in particular, you know, if I wanted to present a respectable religion to my father, the religion that I'd have to present is one where helping other people is the focus, you know. I remember growing up, we used to, although my father's Catholic, but we used to go to this Quaker program some weeks, the purpose of which was essentially to make sandwiches and meals to give out on days for the city's homeless when the churches typically did not operate.
Sure.
So it was meant to sort of fill in the gaps. And going to those, or like sort of Christian groups whose mission was sort of promoting peace and justice and this kind of thing. So I grew up with a very strong impression about the value of works as part of faith.
Sure.
And I think that we have, that is something we have in our tradition, but it's something that I have yet to see fully realized in any meaningful way, outside of perhaps some small examples here and there. So I think, you know, even when I was talking about this with my family, one of the things that I come back to about balancing identity is this sense of, you know, can I guess it's never too late to kind of go back and try to what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of squeeze back in some of the things that I had left behind that I didn't really need to, you know.
This is one
In this
process
area
that
for me,
I believe we're both on. Namely, I'm trying to recapture some of the nicer hobbies, interests that I had, which I had abandoned, and were not necessary for me to abandon, and if anything, would merely complement my Islamic identity, as opposed to be rejected by my Islamic identity. And it's a very difficult process. I mean, I was reflecting upon what you said, and I can imagine how much of a role social justice must have in your life to such a degree, which was, you must really have felt that you got conned to some degree by our community. And as you said, there is always, like, I mean, those who wish to be stubborn in our community could always point out, oh, well, we've had this day and this appeal and that appeal. Sadly, with most of those appeals, what we find is, again, it will be a particular period of the year in which everyone's iman is high, namely Ramadan or Muharram or Arba'in, in which people choose to go out and start doing some social justice work. And again, is your religion, we have this saying in the community where we criticize those who are Muharram Muslims or Ramadan Muslims who only show up for this period of time. Yeah. But again, this is merely a symptom and a disease, and it's a symptom and a result of a disease of being a Muharram or Ramadan Muslim, where people are taking the message of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and applying it only on Muharram. Now, some people might argue that these are very good campaigns, they do a lot of good work, and I don't wish to criticize the community for everything they do. Certainly there was very good intentions behind these campaigns, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless the people who partook in these campaigns for their great efforts. But what I would say is, to some degree, it's somewhat patronizing to the homeless person when he feels that all this social work, all this social justice has merely been part of a larger media campaign to make the community feel good about itself and give themselves a tap on the back for this one day of the year in which they partake in social justice. Where are the Shia soup kitchens? Where are the Shia cafeterias which are making sandwiches for homeless people?
Absolutely.
I do wonder this. And more importantly, what you mentioned before the break, Shaikh Daniel, about those groups who say that let's go out and convert some homeless people. This is the most disgusting and appalling philosophy out there. Inshallah, we hope that Allah might guide such a person through our actions,
Yeah.
but the intention should not be to convert them.
Yeah.
Imam Ali alayhi salam, when he used to defend the rights of the dhimmis, those people who were under the covenant of Islamic law, namely the Jews, the Christians, and any other protected people who pays the jizya under the state of Amir al-Mu'mineen, when he used to see them being oppressed by the Muslims, he wouldn't say, "Look at this poor Christian, treat him well, he might convert." You know, he used to point out that this was a human being who deserved good treatment, as he says in his ahd, his covenant to Malik al-Ashtar, who was his governor over Egypt. He states, people are of two types, either your brother in religion or you're equal in humanity. So we hope that, inshallah ta'ala, we learn to carry out the actual social justices which were demanded of us by the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and we hope more so that we learn to do so in a productive manner where we're not just giving ourselves a tap on the back, where we actually become one of the major players in the world of carrying out social justice within the public mind, within the public eye is what I mean by that.
Wow, I have a lot to add to that. Let me think where to start. I think the first thing that is troublesome to me, I guess, in particular with the way that charity or, let's say, good works are approached, sometimes from within the Muslim community, is that there's selectivity about who's worthy of those. And I guess to give you an example, for instance, if you go to most churches in, not most, but certainly a large number in New York City, they have programming that might include support groups for people with HIV/AIDS or drug support for people who are struggling with drug or alcohol abuse. Some of the more liberal churches may also have harm reduction programming built in terms of needle exchanges or other things like this.
So repeat those two things, Sheikh.
Yeah, sure. So some
Liberal churches.
more liberal churches typically, although not always, tend to have some harm reduction programs built in, which are essentially programs that are not designed to, with the immediate goal of, for instance, getting someone to stop using heroin. It's to get them to use clean needles first, and then over time, the idea is that you see either some quality of life improvement that will lead in the direction of that, without getting too off topic, or will at least prevent transmission of disease.
Sure.
You know, they're very cheap and effective programs. Actually, they've been credited with helping increase public health substantially in the West. But anyway, so they do programs like this, and with sectors of society that people normally don't care about.
Sure.
You know, so I think also if you're doing charity and you're doing it from the purpose of this is a way to sort of spread the religion, or this is the main goal, then of course those are not necessarily the people that you're looking to recruit. And so that for me is one thing that's kind of painful, as well as seeing actually how centers in New York in particular handle the homeless population in the city, even if they happen to come by, because you know they figure out at a certain point what the congregational days of worship are for different religions.
Sure.
You may get people who are panhandling or other things like this, but the way that I've seen that handled by even community leaders is a little heartbreaking sometimes.
It's very disappointing.
So I guess when
I mean, to be fair to
Yeah.
them, I mean, there is somewhat of a dilemma where sadly no one wants to fall prey to being a victim of believing in stereotypes. But sadly we all do have certain mental images in our heads, certain misunderstood ideas which we believe are fact. So just to be fair to these community leaders, I mean, it's a difficult situation to be in, and I thank Allah Azza wa Jalla that I'm not being placed into it.
Yeah.
Do you want to, for example, risk the donations in your masjid going missing? Do you want to risk, for example, anything worthy of material value being stolen by a homeless person and sold on the streets, which I'm sure has happened to some of these leaders?
I mean, luckily the community center that I spend most of my time in is so poor that there's not really anything worth stealing.
Sure.
But I think even with the people who have problems where I would be critical of them in this particular point, these are excellent scholars. They're very strong religious people.
Yes.
But I think that maybe they, in some cases, just haven't sort of made that that connection.
Sure.
So, I guess all this to bring back maybe to the issue of reconstructing identity. I think we have a sort of a broader issue as well that we can look at within that same kind of framework, which is how the Muslim community in the West, and I don't know because it seems fairly well established in the UK, but in the US at least, how much chance there is for the community itself to sort of to work on reconstructing its identity to some extent in positive directions like the ones that we've been discussing. I don't know sort of the lay of the land in the UK, so you'd have to fill me in on that part.
Sure.
But do you think that there are some aspects that we can still, what's the word I'm looking for? We still have a chance to kind of reshape in a very positive way, in a way that will serve humanity and God, and not result in us being these sort of insular kind of communities that are just concerned with the sort of the bells and smells, right? Like the rituals part, and the major holidays and whatever else, and then we pack it up and go home, or we have maybe a community picnic or other nice things, but in ways that we're not interacting, you know?
Absolutely. I do believe that our community over the past 10 years, and I'm sure that many people have noticed it, we've witnessed a flourishing of a younger generation now who, contrary to the philosophy and attitude that their parents may have once had, are beginning to care about religion. They're beginning to wish to go back to the precepts of religion, willing to return back to the ahadith of the Ahlul-Bayt alayhim salam and read from those ahadith directly. We see these people, they have a devotional spirit, one which drives them and causes them to wish to perpetuate the Islam that the Ahlul-Bayt alayhim salam intended for us. As a result, I do personally believe that we are witnessing a generation in which numerous people are coming out who would be willing to help contribute to such a project. However, at the same time, we must be honest. Sometimes such people, who can often even be somewhat, to some degree, a substantial amount, they might not even be that much of a minority, can merely be put off by the fact that they see that no one is proactive in this field. And so they see that there's no one actively carrying it out. I don't have the resources to do so myself, so they give up. I believe all we need is a few people who are willing to lead the way, set up the initiatives, hold a meeting, call out to others, ask, is anyone else willing to help me on this? And for doing so, you can start slowly. You can slowly, and from a small organization, build up rather successful organizations which can help people on a national level.
Even if we don't have the resources available, for instance, in a community, let's say if we're talking about someone, if we put ourselves sort of in our old shoes, in the remaining few minutes we have anyway, are there not ways that we could still take part in other either secular or religious organizations that serve similar purposes in a way that both helps us to engage in helping others and in our own spiritual development, and in something that will promote a positive image of the religion of Islam and Ahlul Bayt, alayhimus salam. Is there some way that we can do that now? And when you think back, is there some way that you feel like you, or that I think back, that I could have achieved a better balance that way?
I believe that yes, in the initial period that we live in right now, where a lack of Shia organizations exist, it's only expected that the lay Muslim has to work with other organizations which already do exist, and there's no problem in doing so. However, I believe that to do so would have to be with the intention of a short-term project. We should have the intention to establish Shi'i organizations with Shi'i principles. So, for example, basic concerns you might have if you're working with charity and non-Muslims organizations. Look, I don't care about the fact that they're non-Muslim. I don't care about the fact that you're doing work for a non-Muslim organization. That's not the problem. The problem here is certain issues which may arise as a result of him being a non-Muslim organization. So, for example, say it's an organization which does sandwiches in soup kitchens, ham sandwiches, pea and ham soup. What are you going to do? Are you going to distribute it?
Sure, and I see what you're saying. But I think by engaging in that way,
concerns.
Yeah, but even by engaging, I think most organizations that do that are probably more than happy to be accommodating in terms of helping out. But sure, no, I get what you're saying. There's absolutely going to be some fiqhi things that will come up, as will come up in any area of living in life in the West. But I think it's in and of itself, I wouldn't want to let that stop anyone.
Plus, I believe that because with the Shi'i community at least, the inspiration for humanitarian action has been the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, that these actions should be carried out in the name of the Ahlul Bayt. I want to say that I mean to be deliberately specific, not to say in the name of Shi'ism.
Yeah.
Look, whatever organization you have, they will be rewarded for what they do, but no one needs to know that you're doing it for your organization and that my organization says great thing. No, do it in the name of Ahlul Bayt. Absolutely. And that way, if a person converts, it doesn't matter. If they don't convert, it doesn't matter either.
So we have about 3 minutes left, or a little bit less than that. I guess out of the remaining questions that I could pose to us, what aspects briefly do you think of one's identity in this sense that tend to either require change or become changed are kind of the most difficult to deal with? And what are some signs that you're integrating these things well?
I think one of the natural problems we encounter is that we are keen to go into an extreme to deal with certain problems we used to have. So, for example, and there are a couple of controversial examples I will give for this, but nonetheless, just bear with me, and inshallah ta'ala I'll try and explain myself. Looking at this from a psychological perspective, I realized that many converts, they have certain traits which they were trying to escape when they came to religion. So, for example, one trait I used to have is I have a profound level of anger at times. When I lose it with someone, I can really lose it. And when I say that, I mean in the past.
I'm glad you haven't lost it with me.
Alhamdulillah. It's just dirbalik, as they would say here in
It's a matter of time.
Iraqi.
2 minutes left.
As an example, in the past, prior to conversion, if someone had made me angry, it would just be all-out war between myself and such a person. So when I converted, I initially tried to reduce that anger, but I would say I did so in the wrong way. And as opposed to addressing that anger and acknowledging I have this problem, I tried to be someone that was so passive I would just let everything fly. And what I found I used to do as a result of that is I would let things drop, build up anger, and then when I need to find some kind of means to get that out, it's going to be purified anger, in a sense that is even worse than the anger I had before I was a non-Muslim, because I've had to kind of be in denial about it and let it out in that way.
So sometimes even managing emotions then is something.
Managing emotions, managing issues which we used to have. So, for example, even again,
I may have to cut you off there, actually, because I think we're at our time limit.
Sure.
But inshallah, we'll be able to pick this up where we left off, and perhaps continue discussing the issue of identity and constructing a Muslim identity. Thank you for joining us again for another episode of The Convertsation. If you'd like to email us, our contact information should be posted on screen. And inshallah, you'll join us for another episode. Sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi tahirin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.